Every night, whether it rained or snowed, someone would listen outside my window. You could hear it from the living room or kitchen, but he always strolled down the street at exactly 3:03 a.m. At first, the sound was quite distant, almost as if it began at the house of the Carson family, until it slowly crept closer. Yesterday, it reached a dead-end street, and I could hear the whistling growing louder as it neared our home. When I was younger, my sister and I would sneak into the kitchen after bedtime to listen. Our parents always scolded us when they caught us, but they had one strict rule. No one was ever allowed to look out the window when the whistling began. I can honestly say that this neighborhood was peculiar. We'd lived here since I was 6 years old, in small but well-kept houses with large gardens and playgrounds. I turned 13 on October 13th, and there were many children our age. We grew up together, running from house to house in the streets. It was a wonderful place to grow up, yet two things always stood out: the whistling and the extreme luck that everyone who lived here seemed to have. The whistling never bothered me. After all, as I said, you couldn't even hear it from my bedroom. Our parents never discussed it, so I never asked any questions. My father was a quiet, reserved man until someone mentioned the whistling. Suddenly, he would speak faster, his eyes flashing with urgency. He insisted that we never forget the one rule: never look out the window when the polystyrene figure passed by our house. He reminded us constantly, and breaking that rule wasn't easy. The inside of the windows had thick roller blinds fastened with sturdy metal hinges. Each hinge had a small padlock, and every night my father would meticulously check that they were securely locked. He kept the keys in his bedroom so neither my sister nor I would be tempted to open the curtains. I never understood what my mother was thinking about when she listened. But I've seen her late at night in the living room, sitting on the big red sofa at 3:03 a.m. I couldn't tell why she sat there, but it seemed as if she listened every single night to that same repetitive melody, which had a strangely cheerful tone. As mentioned, the whistling wasn't the only oddity in our neighborhood. Everyone who lived there had an uncanny streak of luck. My father didn't like discussing it either. It was hard to explain. I seemed to have an unusual knack for winning. Whether it was a contest, a promotion at work, or simply finding something valuable, fortune always smiled on me. Yet there were also inexplicable tragedies. When we first moved in, it was my sister Emily, originally named Nina, who was very sick. She was born prematurely and connected to a respirator. Our parents bought the house because it was close to the hospital. Once we moved in, Emily started getting better. The doctors assumed it was the treatment, and our parents, though aware of what was happening, accepted it as one of the many blessings of living in this neighborhood. And that was why we stayed, even after we discovered that terrible things could happen to those who lived here. As long as you didn't look out the window when the whistlers came by, there was nothing to worry about. Whenever a new family moved into the neighborhood, the welcome committee would greet them at the door with open arms. This happened even when we moved in. People offered us gifts, chocolate, and treats for Emily, who had just been discharged from the hospital. After a little while, they would be asked to leave the room so the adults could talk. I sat in my room but could still hear what was being said. My parents heard how unique and wonderful this neighborhood was, and then the committee would start telling stories about the nightly whistling. They said that between 3:03 and 3:05 a.m. you could hear it from outside the house, and that the whistling was harmless as long as you didn't look out the window. They made it very clear that if you did, you would immediately experience extreme misfortune. Everything would begin to go wrong and terrible tragedies could befall you. In a folder full of newspaper clippings, they showed articles about everything from car accidents to unexplained deaths. Not everyone who died was claimed by it, my father would say, but even if you survived, you'd lose everything you had and your will to live. The spark of life would simply be snatched away. I noticed that my mother didn't take it very seriously. She asked about it several times, and others fell for the story too. After a while, she became agitated, feeling that the welcome committee was trying to scare us into leaving the neighborhood. My father, on the other hand, was open about it. When things couldn't be explained, he took extra precautions to ensure none of us broke the rule. He bought the curtains, hinges, and padlocks. Naturally, I was curious and would sneak out of bed as the clock neared 3. One night, I saw my father sitting in the living room with Emily in his arms, silently waiting for me to join them on the sofa. At exactly 3:03, the whistling began. It passed by our house, then gradually faded, just as it did every night. As long as we never peered out the window, nothing could harm us. And the benefits of living here were enormous. In time, Emily recovered completely. She grew into a strong and clever girl. My father even became part of the welcome committee, always present when new families moved in. Although it happened rarely since no one really wanted to leave when it did, we always received gifts, food, and more newspaper clippings. I could tell my father was unsettled if he hadn't managed to convince the new neighbors of the importance of the rule. And if someone broke it, it wasn't long before we had new neighbors. Not long ago, a new family moved in across the street. Until then, Mrs. Matson had lived in that house. She reached 105 and had led a long, full life. The new neighbors quickly settled in. Believing in the welcome committee's story, they installed roller blinds with hinges just as my father had done. They were a young family with small children, so it was best not to take any unnecessary risks. My father never let us see the newspaper clippings in the folder, but they were enough to convince our neighbors that all the rules were to be followed. At least for that month, everything went smoothly without any problems. One evening, when the neighbor's family was about to leave town, their 12-year-old son, Harry, was to spend the night with us. I didn't know him very well, but I quickly sensed that his presence would bring challenges. "Do you know who that is? The one who listens outside," my little sister whispered before I could answer. "We're not talking about that," I replied. "I think it's that odd fellow who lives in the big yellow house." "No, he's really nice," Emily answered softly. "Maybe he's just a crazy serial killer?" I asked, not noticing how scared Emily had become. "We're not talking about it," I repeated. "Perhaps we should go back to my room." We played video games for a while, but I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was amiss as the clock neared 3. "No, we haven't," I sighed. "You know, I can't do something that I once promised my father. You see, my father always fastened the curtains and hid the keys." "That's what my father does too," Emily agreed. "No," Harry immediately objected. "He doesn't. It irritates me when the curtains are left undone." I remembered that Harry always kept his keychain close by. I was already anxious about what he might do next. Then I noticed that my father had stopped hiding his key. He knew we understood the gravity of the situation. After my father had pulled the curtains to lock them, I sneaked into his room and found his keychain. "You're lying," I said, but Harry just shrugged. "You can check for yourself. Just open his bedroom door and see if his keychain is on the nightstand." "Stay here," I ordered both of them. "Don't go anywhere." I hurried to the bedroom but hesitated at the door. If we revealed the truth, my father would be furious. I was nearly scared just thinking about it. I was even more afraid that the window might be open while the Whistler was outside. Carefully, I opened the door and peered in. It was too dark to see anything. I don't think my eyes adjusted to the darkness. I stopped after a few steps. The whistling had started to reach me louder than ever before. I'd never seen my parents hear the sound as clearly from their own bedroom. It seemed they had heard it every night without telling us. I stood there listening as the whistling drew nearer. I didn't know whether to turn on the light or call for my father, but before I could do anything, I heard sounds from the living room. "Emily!" Harry shouted as he ran out of the bedroom. I saw him and Emily by the window. I noticed that Harry was fiddling with one of the padlocks on the roller blind's hinges. In the next moment, I heard a click as he twisted the key. "Harry has gotten hold of the keychain from my father," I thought, "and now he's planning to open the blind." The whistling raged just outside our house. Emily stood frozen, scared but also a bit curious. It felt as if time had stopped. I believe I shouted something, though I can't recall what. Before I knew it, I was moving towards Harry and Emily. I've never been particularly fast, but I reached them within seconds. My gaze was fixed on Emily, but I heard Harry pulling down the roller blind, and it began to slip open with a faint click. I could hear the whistling right outside. Suddenly, arms wrapped around Emily as she was pulled away, and she turned her back to the window. At the same moment, I shut my eyes as tightly as I could. I reached out one hand and felt that someone, perhaps even a man, was still standing at the window. His fingertips brushed the glass and I could feel its icy chill. I kept my eyes closed while fumbling for the blind's cord. The edge of the window wasn't as cold, but I felt a slight vibration through the glass. I couldn't bear to think about what might be on the other side. Finally, I grasped the cord and jerked it until the blind closed. When I opened my eyes, I could barely make out Harry in the weak light coming from the kitchen. He looked pale and exhausted, his lip cut so badly that blood streamed down his chin. "Are you all right, Harry?" I asked, my voice trembling as I began to scream. Everything happened all at once. The hallway light suddenly flicked on and I heard my parents running over. I could only stare at Harry, who was as white as chalk. My father asked, "What is happening here?" I turned towards my parents. He said only that I had managed to hold out somehow. I had never seen my father truly scared before, his face twisted in sheer panic. "Is it only Harry who looked out the window?" he asked. "Can't it be?" Only then did relief begin to show on his face, as if he might let out a victorious cheer. But when he turned towards the others, all joy vanished. There was a knock on the door. We all stood frozen, and I could hear Harry's mother calling from the far end of the hallway. My mother, always the skeptic, seemed to believe that it was all just a ploy to calm my father's nerves. But in that moment I realized that she, too, understood that this was real. Both of my parents armed themselves with what looked like makeshift weapons, ready to defend our home. The knocking resumed, this time more aggressively. "Please, you must not open the door," my father cried. He went to Harry and wrapped his arms around him. "We will not open this door," he said firmly. Nothing was allowed to enter our house. This time the knocking was so forceful that the entire door trembled. I could see my mother and Emily clinging to each other as my father reassured us. The knocking grew louder and soon my mother whispered, "Should we call the police?" At that moment the knocking subsided. My father began to speak, but his words were drowned out by frantic pounding, which quickly turned into gentle taps on the door. Then came a voice on the other side, a police officer, as my mother repeated the words almost like a parrot. Before we could understand, the knocking was interrupted again. My mother clutched us even tighter. "Please, just leave us in peace," she whispered. "It won't help to call anyone, we never know when it'll be safe to open the door." The pounding continued sporadically until, suddenly, the door shook as if about to fly off its hinges. Then after a while the knocking stopped, only to resume again from the front door. It alternated between heavy and gentle taps. In the next moment, both doors were knocked on simultaneously, accompanied by the sound of hammering. Then we heard someone striking the windows and walls. "Stop!" Harry screamed. "Back there, I promise I won't say a word," he pleaded while still staring at the door. "Just go away. I won't tell anyone what I said." For almost a minute, everything was silent. Then we heard a soft tapping from the window. Harry had peeked out earlier and now began to cry, overcome with an intense emotion. My father continued to comfort him, patting his back without even bothering to explain that there was nothing to fear. Yet the tapping at the window persisted throughout the night. We huddled together in the living room for what felt like an eternity. Finally, my mother tried to lead us to our bedrooms, but as soon as we moved, the pounding resumed, more forceful than ever. I was almost terrified that the door would be smashed in. As soon as we returned to the living room, the sound ceased, though we could still hear a faint tapping on the window. None of us managed to sleep that night. The pounding finally stopped around 7 in the morning, just as the sun began to rise. We waited a few more hours before pulling back the curtains, as my father had instructed us never to be in the living room. After a short while, he also went into his bedroom and later announced that it was safe. His parents came to pick him up in the late morning, and my parents accompanied them home, staying to talk. Emily and I tried to see what was going on from the window but couldn't catch any of the conversation. Emily stayed close to me all day, still visibly frightened. That Sunday, when my parents eventually returned, they seemed subdued and refused to explain what they had discussed. We spent the rest of the day quietly. When evening came, we ordered a pizza and watched a movie together in my room. That night, there was no more pounding. It had ceased completely. We didn't see or hear from Harry or his family for several days, but by the end of the week, we spotted a moving truck outside their house. I still remember Harry looked exhausted. He and his family seemed gloomy, pale, and lifeless. Even from across the street, we could sense that something was terribly wrong. They left before sunset and we never saw them again. I still recall the welcome committee had once told us that not everyone who encounters the whistling will die. Some merely lose their will to live as tragedy followed tragedy. Perhaps Harry's parents also peered out of their windows, maybe trying to comfort him, or hoping to understand what was happening. If Emily had looked out that night, perhaps I might have done the same. We still live in the same house, and every night we hear the whistling right outside our window. The many blessings of this neighborhood make it hard to move away, and we are more cautious than ever. We no longer invite friends over for sleepovers, and every night my father locks the keys away. I have never ever dared to open the curtains. Some things are best left unseen.
That's it for tonight's tale. But don't worry, there's always more where that came from. Be sure to stay tuned for even more nerve-thrilling horror stories every single week. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and join us here at the Hollow Horror. You won't want to miss what's coming next. Until then, stay safe. Or stay scared. See you next time.